But the hunt for bin Laden was anything but a game. For a decade, it was job one for the U.S. military because winning the war on terror was unthinkable without his capture or death. Tonight, the National's Terrance Mckenna takes us inside that long search, the close calls, the mistakes, and the breaks that make this the world's most compelling example of cat and mouse.
This was the last time U.S. intelligence had Osama bin Laden in their sights. A tall man dressed in white, surrounded by commandos dressed in black. The video came from a Predator drone flying over bin Laden's compound in Kandahar, Afghanistan on September 7, 2000, 1 year before 9/11. Back then, the Predators were brand new and not yet able to carry missiles, and so bin Laden escaped death. Starting in 1996, the CIA had been conducting aerial surveillance of bin Laden's house and had an entire unit of CIA officers tracking his every move. The head of that unit was Michael Scheuer.
By the end of '96, it was apparent that bin Laden was much more than a tall Saudi spendthrift, that he was a very articulate man and a very much a odd combination of a medieval theologian and a 21st century CEO. He was someone who could manage an organization and drive it toward particular goals.
The CIA assembled assassination squads to go after bin Laden. And then after his bombing attack against the U.S. African embassies in 1998, which killed 17. President Bill Clinton tried to kill bin Laden with a cruise missile attack. He missed. 8 days after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, CIA counterterrorism chief Cofer Black called in the lead agent heading into Afghanistan, Gary Schroen.
I went in on the morning of the 19th to see Cofer, and his final orders were, I want to make this very clear, Gary, your job is to find bin Laden, kill him, and bring his head back to the United States on dry ice so that we can show the president. And I said, well, I don't think it could be any clearer than that, Cofer.
I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, wanted, dead or alive.
In December 2001, bin Laden was chased up into the mountains at Tora Bora on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. American generals decided to let Afghan soldiers go after him rather than risk the lives of British and U.S. troops. The CIA was flabbergasted.
But the generals were pretty hard over on not risking their own troops, which I think probably was extraordinarily unpopular amongst their troops. The British Marines were nearby, our Marines were nearby. 10th Mountain Division was right there. And it was really a political decision to make sure that there weren't too many American casualties. The result was bin Laden on the lam for a decade.
For the last 10 years, 2 American presidents have poured an astonishing amount of money and man-hours into the hunt for Osama bin Laden. One CIA agent described it as a search with 1 million dead ends, and then finally, a few useful tidbits. The closing chapter of this drama has been filled with tension, errors, and controversy. As chief of counterterrorism at the White House, John Brennan was instrumental in this week's mission. A longtime CIA agent, he has been involved in the hunt for Osama bin Laden for 15 years.
Tora Bora was certainly the last time that we had actionable and we thought was very credible information about where he was located. A number of leads have been pursued over the years. I think what this operation demonstrates is that there are some very, very good people who have been following bin Laden for many, many years.
The first tidbit of evidence that led to bin Laden showed up in the city of Peshawar in Pakistan's northwest frontier province last July. CIA operatives located a man who had been identified as a possible bin Laden courier. They didn't even know his real name.
over time, we're able to piece together additional information, get the name he was known by, his nom de guerre, associate that then eventually with his real name, and track it until we got to the compound in Abbottabad.
The Abbottabad compound was found because it was listed in the courier's real name. It clearly cost more than the courier should have been able to afford, and it featured high walls, barbed wire, and privacy screens that made it suitable for hiding a high-value target. Back in July 2008, then-candidate Obama had outlined what his policy would be in this situation.
We must make it clear that if Pakistan cannot or will not act, we will take out high-level terrorist targets like bin Laden if we have them in our sights.
The CIA set up a surveillance post nearby, but were never able to get a photograph clearly showing that Osama bin Laden lived in the Abbottabad compound. Over a period of 6 months, however, they became more and more convinced he was there.
We noticed an individual who was pacing in the courtyard who at least had some of the appearances of it, but we were never able to verify that in fact it was him. But when you put all of these pieces together, the security precautions, the nature of the compound, some of the additional information that we had gotten, we had the best intelligence case that we ever had on bin Laden since Tora Bora.
The U.S. military carefully mapped out the compound and then built an exact replica of it in the United States. U.S. Navy Special Forces teams, called SEALs, began rehearsing for the eventual attack on the compound.
You can imagine that for something as important as this and something as risky as this, every effort would be made to do the practice runs, understand the complexities and the layout of the compound, so that once they hit the compound, they had already simulated that a number of times.
U.S. Special Forces all require really an astounding amount of detailed material. Not just the size of the building, but do the doors lock in the handle, or is there a different padlock? Do the windows open in or out? All of that material goes into planning a special operations raid.
In the discussions at the White House, there were repeated references to two old nightmare scenarios. The first was the Iran rescue mission in 1980 that ended in a disastrous helicopter crash in the desert that was a propaganda nightmare for the United States, and especially for the president that ordered it, Jimmy Carter. The second nightmare scenario was the famous Black Hawk Down disaster in Somalia in 1993. Another helicopter crash which resulted in the bodies of U.S. servicemen being dragged through the streets.
All of those risks were debated, all of them were, thoroughly explored, and in the end, I think that's why the president made a very gutsy decision by deciding that for all of those risks, we had to do this.
President Obama wanted to keep up appearances on Sunday morning as the mission deadline neared. He returned to the White House from a golf game at 2 p.m. On the other side of the world, it was already nighttime. 79 soldiers mounted up in Black Hawk helicopters and flew over the Pakistan border at midnight. The Pakistanis were not warned they were coming. They entered Pakistani airspace undetected and moved towards the Abbottabad compound. In the Situation Room at the White House, this was the moment of maximum tension.
It was probably one of the most anxiety-filled periods of time, I think, in the lives of the people who were assembled here yesterday. The minutes passed like days, and the president was very concerned about the security of our personnel. That was what was on his mind throughout, but it was clearly very tense, a lot of people holding their breath, and there was a fair degree of silence as it progressed, as we would get the updates.
The plan as rehearsed called for 2 Black Hawk helicopters to approach the compound. The first helicopter would drop ropes into the courtyard and a dozen soldiers would rappel down. Another dozen from the second helicopter were to rappel down onto the roof of the main building. A setback occurred when the first helicopter clipped the compound wall on the way in and landed on the ground instead.
The other helicopter made the decision not to go over the roof, but to set down, so that both helicopters sat on the ground, and both teams immediately went into the compound itself. They had to breach about 3 or 4 walls in order to get in there, and they immediately then went into the compound itself and fought their way up to the 3rd floor.
The only pictures that emerged were these grisly ones of the first 2 to die in the assault, the courier and his brother, and of bin Laden's son Khalid. There were no pictures released of bin Laden himself. A key question is whether this was a kill mission or whether bin Laden would have been allowed to surrender.
The authority here was to kill bin Laden. Obviously, under their rules of engagement, if he had in fact thrown up his hands, surrendered, and didn't appear to represent any kind of threat, then they were to capture him. But they had full authority to kill him.
Here is where the White House version of events came off the rails. Counterterrorism Director John Brennan said repeatedly that bin Laden fought back and that he used his wife as a human shield.
And he was using her as a shield.
She served as a shield. She was positioned in a way that indicated that she was being used as a shield.
Did he get his hand on a gun, and did he fire himself?
He was engaged in a firefight with those that entered the area of the house that he was in, and whether or not he got off any rounds, I quite frankly don't know.
Later, the White House corrected this version, admitting that bin Laden was unarmed and did not use his wife as a human shield.
The post-operation has been botched fairly seriously. It turns out, though, that he was unarmed. It isn't clear that there were any arms in the room. And several senior officials have said that the only way that they would have accepted a surrender is if he was nude. And it was hardly likely they were going to find him padding around the house in his all-together.
After the completion of the mission, a larger Chinook helicopter was brought in to help fly the assault team back to Afghanistan.
We're going towards turning point 3.
The Pakistani Air Force was finally scrambling aircraft to respond to the intrusion in their airspace.
95.
We didn't contact the Pakistanis until after all of our people, all of our aircraft were out of Pakistani airspace.
We're about to cross the wire.
At that time, the Pakistanis were reacting to an incident that they knew was taking place in Abbottabad. Therefore, they were scrambling some of their assets.
Former UN Ambassador John Bolton says that for decades, the U.S. government has not trusted its Pakistan allies.
I think there's great uncertainty who in Pakistan you can trust. That's nothing new. It was true for years when we said to the Pakistanis, you're building nuclear weapons, and they said, oh no, we're not. So it's kind of an inherent problem in dealing with Pakistan.
Back at the compound, neighbors with cell phone cameras recorded the fiery aftermath of the raid. The soldiers had blown up their disabled helicopter on the way out. Scenes of the bloody bedroom where Osama bin Laden died led to a debate about whether it was better to kill or capture him.
You don't want, really, a man of his eloquence and his persuasive abilities to be speaking for several years from some kind of courtroom somewhere. Whatever al-Qaeda was planning to do next in the United States, Osama bin Laden was at the center of it. And so we took out the man who was at the center of 9/11 and certainly would have been at the center of another attack. And we have now a dead martyr rather than a live smart guy, which is always a preferable situation.
After bin Laden's body was photographed and DNA tested at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, it was transported by helicopter to the USS Carl Vinson, an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea.
Aboard the USS Carl Vinson, the burial of bin Laden was done in conformance with Islamic precepts and practices. The deceased's body was washed and then placed in a white sheet. The body was placed in a weighted bag. A military officer read prepared religious remarks, which were translated into Arabic by a native speaker. After the words were complete, the body was placed on a prepared flat board, tipped up, and the deceased body eased into the sea.